September 9th, 1941. The receiver on Georgy Zhukov's desk buzzed at 1:30 in the morning. The voice on the other end was unmistakable, even through the crackle of the long-distance connection. Joseph Stalin wasted no time on pleasantries. "Zhukov," Stalin stated. "Leningrad, the birthplace of the Bolshevik Revolution, the city bearing Lenin's name, stands on the brink of being overrun by the Germans." Zhukov, a 44-year-old already recognized as one of the Red Army's most proficient commanders, grasped the unspoken gravity. If the city fell, the political and psychological ramifications would be devastating. Stalin's tone left no room for negotiation. This was not a suggestion. "When do I depart?" Zhukov inquired. "Immediately," Stalin responded. "A transport awaits." 12 hours later, Zhukov arrived in a city already encircled on three sides. The thunder of German artillery was close enough to be heard as his vehicle navigated streets where citizens were toiling with their bare hands, excavating anti-tank trenches. The reality was far graver than what had been conveyed from Moscow. The former commander, Kliment Voroshilov, one of Stalin's oldest associates, had proven incapable of orchestrating a robust defense. German forces had severed the last remaining rail link. The noose was tightening. Zhukov proceeded directly to the headquarters of the Leningrad front. Maps revealed enemy positions less than 10 kilometers from the city's core in certain sectors. He studied them intently, his jaw set firm. Then, he began issuing directives in the precise, rapid cadence that would become his hallmark. Artillery units would be redeployed. Infantry divisions would be consolidated. Every available weapon would be directed against the German advance. "And one more thing," he informed the assembled officers. "Any soldier who retreats without explicit orders will face execution." The intelligence reached Stalin that night. Zhukov's assessment was stark. The city could be preserved, but only if reinforcements arrived without delay and if the defenders demonstrated absolute resolve. Any contemplation of evacuation or withdrawal was to cease. Leningrad would hold its ground, or it would face obliteration, but it would not be yielded. Stalin's reply arrived within hours, brief, direct, and would be echoed in various forms throughout the ensuing months. 5. This directive became the unyielding principle guiding all subsequent actions. Yet, in those initial weeks of September, as German artillery commenced its relentless bombardment, destined to continue for 872 days, no one in Moscow could be certain of the city's survival. Stalin understood Leningrad's strategic significance. He was acutely aware of its symbolic weight. He also knew that sentiment would not halt advancing German tanks, nor would faith in the revolution nourish a famished populace. Once provisions dwindled, by the close of September, the Germans had finalized their encirclement. The sole connection to the remainder of the Soviet Union was across Lake Ladoga, and even that lifeline was subjected to continuous aerial assault. A metropolis of 3 million inhabitants was isolated. In Moscow, Stalin received daily dispatches detailing casualty figures, munitions consumption, and food reserves. This last category assumed paramount importance. Dmitry Pavlov, the official tasked with food distribution in Leningrad, calculated that at existing consumption rates, the city possessed enough flour for 35 days, grain for 30 days, and meat for 33 days. Thereafter, widespread starvation would commence. Stalin arrived at the calculation that would define his strategy for Leningrad for the subsequent 2.5 years. The city could not be swiftly relieved. German defenses were too formidable. However, it could be sustained precariously via the lake route. Sufficient supplies might be transported to sustain the population and garrison, albeit not in comfort. The city would endure hardship, but it would persevere. He decreed the establishment of what would become known as the Road of Life, the supply corridor across Lake Ladoga. During the autumn, barges and vessels would ferry provisions across the open waters. In winter, once the lake froze, trucks would traverse the ice. It was a desperate measure, vulnerable to air attacks and adverse weather, yet it was the sole recourse. The initial winter tested this strategy almost to its breaking point. By November, German artillery had pinpointed the range to most of the city. Shells fell indiscriminately day and night, claiming lives in residences, queues for bread, and on the streets. However, the bombardment was not the primary cause of death for Leningrad's victims. That grim distinction belonged to famine and the biting cold. On November 20th, provisions were reduced further. Workers were allocated 375 grams of bread daily. All other individuals received 200 grams. The bread itself was barely recognizable. Bakers incorporated sawdust, cellulose, and cottonseed cake into the flour to augment its volume. People meticulously chewed the mixture, striving to extract every possible calorie. In December, rations were cut once more. 125 grams of bread for dependents and children, 250 grams for workers. That was the entirety of official provisions. 125 grams of bread, approximately 4 thin slices, to sustain a human being for an entire day in sub-freezing temperatures. Individuals began succumbing in their apartments, remaining frozen as their families lacked the strength to move the deceased. Others collapsed in the thoroughfares, only to be covered by snow. The mortality rate surged into the thousands daily, then tens of thousands. Leningrad was transforming into a necropolis. Reports reached Stalin's desk. He perused them without any outward display of emotion, according to those who witnessed it. He posed inquiries regarding the tonnage transported across Lake Ladoga. He sought precise figures on the number of trucks that had broken through the ice and been lost. He demanded explanations for why more provisions were not reaching their destination. Yet, he remained steadfast in his fundamental decision. Leningrad would not be evacuated. It would not be surrendered. It would be defended. Certain historians have debated whether Stalin fully comprehended the extent of the suffering within Leningrad during that inaugural winter. Others contend that he possessed complete understanding and made a calculated decision that the strategic advantage of immobilizing German forces outside the city justified the civilian casualties. The truth is likely both simpler and more intricate. Stalin operated with vast numbers and strategic objectives. Individual suffering, even on an immense scale, was an abstract concept to him. What mattered was the city's continued resistance, and it did resist. Throughout January and February of 1942, as the death toll surpassed 600,000, the Red Army garrison maintained its defensive positions. Factories that remained operational continued producing munitions and repairing armaments. The city refused to capitulate. By March, the worst of the famine had receded. This was not due to any substantial improvement in conditions, but rather because so many had perished that the remaining populace could be sustained by the limited supplies trickling in. Rations saw a slight increase. The ice road across Lake Ladoga had facilitated sufficient deliveries to avert complete collapse. The arrival of spring brought the prospect of evacuating some civilians across the lake before its thaw. Stalin's attention during this period was divided among numerous critical situations. The Battle of Moscow, the planning for summer offensives, and the persistent pressure from the Allies to open a second front. Leningrad constituted one challenge among many, not the most pressing, yet it was never forgotten. Directives continued to be dispatched from Moscow to the Leningrad front. Endeavors to breach the blockade were conceived and initiated, though none proved successful in 1942. The city navigated its second winter under conditions superior to the first, though superior was a relative term. Rations remained minimal. Bombardment persisted. People continued to perish from hunger and cold, albeit in smaller numbers. The road of life operated with greater efficiency, transporting more supplies across the frozen lake. However, the fundamental situation remained unchanged. Leningrad remained isolated, under siege, slowly succumbing. Stalin's public pronouncements concerning Leningrad during this period were infrequent and meticulously worded. He lauded the city's defenders in speeches. He issued commendations for their bravery. Yet, he made no visits. He offered no grand assurances of imminent relief. He was too much of a pragmatist for such gestures. The strategic landscape did not permit a major offensive to shatter the blockade. The Red Army was still in the process of learning how to effectively combat the Wehrmacht. Premature assaults would result in unnecessary loss of life and yield no tangible results. However, by late 1942, the strategic equilibrium began to shift. The triumph at Stalingrad in February 1943 would mark the pivotal turning point of the entire conflict. Preceding that, in January 1943, a less extensive but symbolically vital victory would be achieved at Leningrad. Operation Iskra, named after the revolutionary publication founded by Lenin, was envisioned as a coordinated strike by two fronts. The Leningrad front would advance eastward. The Volkhov front would push westward. If they could achieve a link-up, a land corridor to the city would be established, thereby breaking the complete encirclement. The operation commenced on January 12, 1943. Soviet artillery unleashed a massive barrage along the entire front south of Lake Ladoga. Subsequently, the infantry advanced through snow and across frozen marshland. German defenses were formidable, having been fortified over more than a year of occupation. The combat was ferocious and at close quarters. For 6 days, the outcome remained uncertain. Soviet forces made slow progress, sustaining heavy casualties. Then, on January 18th, units from the Leningrad front and the Volkhov front converged near Worker Settlement Number 5. The corridor was narrow, measuring only 8 to 11 kilometers in width at its most constricted point, and still vulnerable to German artillery fire. But it existed. Leningrad was no longer entirely cut off. The news reached Stalin's desk within hours. He was in his Kremlin office conferring with members of the State Defense Committee when an aide delivered the telegram. Stalin read it, then reread it. He looked up at the men present. "Leningrad," he declared, "the blockade is broken." The emotions he experienced at that moment are unrecorded. Stalin was not prone to overt emotional displays, at least not in the presence of his subordinates. However, his subsequent actions provided insight into his state of mind. He promptly drafted Order Number 95 to be issued that very day. The order congratulated the troops of the Leningrad and Volkhov fronts for their triumph. It commended their valor and determination and included a unique provision. An artillery salute would be fired in Leningrad itself to commemorate the breakthrough. This was extraordinary. Artillery salutes were typically conducted in Moscow to signify victories. To orchestrate one in Leningrad, a city still under siege and subject to bombardment, was a powerful statement. It was Stalin's manner of acknowledging the city's ordeal and the significance of its survival. The salute was conducted on the evening of January 18th. 24 volleys from 324 guns. People emerged from their dwellings, braving the cold and peril, to listen. Some wept, others stood in silent contemplation. For 872 days, their ears had registered only the impact of German shells. Now, they heard Soviet cannons firing in celebration. Stalin's order was broadcast via loudspeakers throughout the city. His words were formal, as always, yet they carried immense weight. The defenders of Leningrad had achieved what many had deemed impossible. They had held out under conditions that would have overwhelmed most cities. And now, finally, there was tangible evidence that their sacrifice had not been in vain. In the weeks that followed, a railway line was constructed through the narrow corridor. It ran within range of German artillery, and trains were frequently targeted. Crews colloquially referred to it as the corridor of death, yet it functioned. Provisions began to flow into Leningrad in quantities that had been unattainable during the blockade. Food rations increased. Coal for heating arrived. The city commenced a gradual recovery. Stalin's focus on Leningrad intensified after the breakthrough. He desired the corridor's expansion. He sought to push German forces beyond artillery range. He aimed for the complete dissolution of the siege. However, he remained realistic about achievable outcomes. The Wehrmacht was still a formidable adversary, capable of fierce resistance. An ill-timed offensive could fail and jeopardize the gains already secured. Consequently, the city endured another year. The corridor remained narrow and perilous, but operational. Life in Leningrad transitioned from catastrophic to merely dire. People could consume sufficient sustenance to survive without succumbing to slow starvation. Factories augmented their output. The garrison received reinforcements and resupply. Gradually, the balance of power shifted. By January 1944, the moment for the decisive offensive had arrived. The Red Army had grown stronger. The Wehrmacht had been depleted through repeated defeats across the entire Eastern Front. The Leningrad Front, now under the command of Leonid Govorov, had amassed overwhelming superiority in manpower and materiel. The offensive commenced on January 14, 1944. This time, there was no protracted struggle. Soviet forces shattered German defenses with the weight of experience and firepower. Within 2 weeks, the Germans were in full retreat. On January 27th, Stalin issued another order. The siege of Leningrad was concluded. That evening, a second artillery salute was fired, this one in Moscow. 324 guns firing 24 volleys, mirroring the salute in Leningrad a year prior. However, this time, the salute signified not merely a breakthrough, but a complete victory. Stalin's order of the day was broadcast across the entire Soviet Union. It lauded the defenders of Leningrad in terms he rarely employed. The city had endured 872 days of siege. It had faced bombardment, starvation, and brutal cold. It had lost over 600,000 of its inhabitants, though the actual figure was undoubtedly higher, and it had never surrendered. For Stalin, Leningrad's survival held multiple implications. Strategically, it had occupied German forces that could have been deployed elsewhere. Politically, it had demonstrated the resilience of the Soviet system, or at least the unwavering willingness of Soviet citizens to endure unimaginable hardship rather than submit to Nazi occupation. Personally, it validated his decision to preserve the city at any cost, a decision that had drawn skepticism from some of his own commanders. Yet, there was an additional dimension to Stalin's reaction to Leningrad's endurance, something more difficult to quantify. The city had defied his expectations. In September 1941, when he dispatched Zhukov to assume command. He had harbored hope for the city's preservation, but certainty remained elusive. The Germans were at the zenith of their power. The Red Army was reeling from devastating defeats. The fall of Leningrad appeared entirely plausible. That it did not succumb, that it persevered through conditions that should have broken any city, represented a form of vindication. Not for Stalin personally, though he would undoubtedly claim credit, but for the Soviet Union's capacity to resist and ultimately defeat Nazi Germany. If Leningrad could endure, then the entire nation could endure. Stalin never visited Leningrad during the war. He never witnessed the mass graves, the emaciated survivors, or the ruins left by years of relentless bombardment. He experienced the siege solely through dispatches and statistical data, abstract notations on paper. Whether he truly grasped the depth of the city's people's suffering remains unknowable. However, in January 1943, upon the breaking of the blockade, and again in January 1944, with the lifting of the siege, he recognized the profound significance of these events. His directives and the salutes were his chosen method of acknowledging this realization. Leningrad had not fallen. It would not fall. And within that survival lay the harbinger of ultimate victory. The city would bear the indelible marks of the siege for generations. Buildings stood damaged for years after the war's cessation. Survivors carried psychological wounds that never fully healed. The mass graves at Piskaryovskoye Memorial Cemetery held hundreds of thousands of bodies, most unidentified. The true death toll would forever remain uncertain, but the city endured. That was what mattered to Stalin in January 1943, when he drafted Order No. 95 and mandated the artillery salute. That was what mattered in January 1944, when he issued his victory proclamation. Leningrad had held firm. The Germans had failed in their objective to capture it. And from that failure, from that defiant endurance, emerged irrefutable proof that the Wehrmacht could be halted, could be fought to a standstill, and could ultimately be defeated. Stalin's pronouncement upon realizing Leningrad would not fall was not eloquent. It was not profound. It was the utterance of a man focused on tangible results and strategic outcomes. 9. He stated when the news arrived, and then he ordered a salute, which served as his way of expressing what words could not easily convey. That the city had held when it should have crumbled, that its people had endured when endurance seemed an impossibility, that the cradle of the revolution had not been surrendered to fascism. These were the meanings imbued within that salute, within those orders, within Stalin's recognition of what Leningrad's survival symbolized. The siege had persisted for 872 days. It had exacted a toll of over 600,000 lives, a figure representing only documented fatalities. The actual cost was considerably higher. But the city had not capitulated, and in January 1943, when Stalin commanded that artillery salute to be fired in Leningrad itself, he was acknowledging a fundamental truth that would shape the remainder of the war. The Soviet Union could not be broken. Its people would endure any suffering rather than yield. And the Wehrmacht, despite its formidable power and tactical prowess, could not overcome this combination of resolve and sacrifice. Leningrad's survival was not preordained. It necessitated decisions made in Moscow by Stalin to sustain the city at all costs. It required the road of life across Lake Ladoga, that desperate supply route that barely kept the city functioning. It demanded the garrison's unwavering determination to man the defenses even as they starved. It depended on the civilians who continued to work in factories, their strength waning by the day. It involved all of these elements, coupled with an element of fortune and the German decision to besiege rather than assault directly. But it happened. The city persevered. And when Stalin realized it would not fall, when the breakthrough occurred in January 1943, his response was characteristically practical. He issued an order. He commanded a salute. He then turned his attention to the next pressing crisis. Such was Stalin's operational methodology. Emotion was perceived as weakness. Sentiment was deemed irrelevant. What mattered was the strategic situation and the decisions required to shape it. Leningrad had held. Consequently, the decision to defend it had been correct. Therefore, the sacrifices made had been justified. The logic was circular, yet complete. The citizens of Leningrad experienced the siege in a profoundly different manner. For them, it was not an abstract concept or a strategic calculation. It was the daily struggle for existence reduced to the pursuit of sustenance, warmth, and survival. It was witnessing the demise of loved ones. It was consuming bread made from sawdust. It was burning furniture to ward off the winter's chill. It was all of this and more compressed into 872 days of profound suffering. But they held on. And when the blockade was breached, when the siege was lifted, when the artillery salute resonated through their city, they understood its significance. They had survived. Against all conceivable odds, against conditions engineered for their destruction, they had endured. Stalin's acknowledgement of that survival, conveyed through his orders and salutes, represented the closest he came to recognizing the human cost of his strategic imperatives. He would never offer an apology for the suffering endured. He would never question whether the price had been excessive. Such was not his nature. But in January 1943, when he decreed that artillery salute to be fired in Leningrad, he was articulating something. Not to the world, not even truly to the city itself, but to history. Leningrad had held its ground. The siege had failed. And from that failure emerged the genesis of Germany's ultimate defeat. This was Stalin's implicit message when he realized Leningrad would not fall. Not through spoken words, but through directives. Not through emotional expression, but through recognition of strategic reality. The city had survived. Therefore, the Soviet Union would survive. Therefore, victory was attainable.